Very warm welcome to tonight's online travel event about Iceland. My name is Kate Suarez and I'm the Alumni Travel Manager at the University of Oxford, and I'm also joined here by Claire Baxter, who looks after the travel programme at Cambridge. So before we get started, just a reminder that tonight's event is recorded. If at any point during the lecture you have any questions or you need assistance, please just use the chat function at the bottom of your screens and we will do our best to help you. Likewise, if you have any general questions about the Alumni Travel Programme, please let Claire or myself know in the chat function, also at the bottom of the screens. So tonight's event has been organised by the help of Alice Burns at Temple World. Temple World is a specialist in tailor-made travel, and they've also been involved with alumni travel for more than 30 years. They are in fact one of our most long-standing tour operators with the alumni travel programmes at Oxford and Cambridge. And Alice has been working very closely with Bob White, organising a trip to Iceland later this year. So before we hand over to Bob, Alice would like to say a few words. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you, Kate, for your kind introduction. I'll be brief as I know we're all eager to get to the main event. I'm Alice, I'm the Director of Temple World Travel. Temple World was founded in the 1970s by my father, an academic, actually an archaeologist, with the idea of taking students out to see digs and research in action overseas. Over the years, we've evolved into a worldwide small group tour specialist operating tours for universities and museums like the British Museum and the Smithsonian, all led by experts and academics. We've been designing tours for Oxford and Cambridge since the very start of the Alumni Travel Programme, a few decades ago now. And alongside the small group tours, as Kate said, we also work on tailor-made holidays, which is something I introduced when I joined the family business 10 years ago. We have 9 tours planned for 2021 for alumni of Oxford and Cambridge. And looking ahead to 2022, we already have 1 tour planned for the Oberammergau Passion Play, which was postponed from 2020. As you can see, it's quite a diverse range of tours. We have wildlife-based trips, such as our Costa Rica tour, which is led by the ornithologist Nick Davies, who some of you may already know if you signed up to any of these Zoom talks late last year. And we have archaeology themed tours like our Jewels of Jordan tour, which is led by Neil Faulkner. If any of you read any archaeology magazines, you'll know he's an expert on Lawrence of Arabia. We have a couple of brilliant cruises too, on some really lovely small boats. Our Croatia cruise only takes 32, for example, and our Turquoise Coast tour is aboard a beautiful Gillette, which takes only 18. And because of the size of the boat, it just means we're able to visit much smaller bays. Some of them have amazing ancient ruins in them. Most of them, they're not reachable by road, so we kind of have them all to ourselves, which is lovely. But of course, the trip I would like to highlight today is our Wonders of Iceland tour, which we are hoping to run this July, fingers crossed, because the trip scholar on that tour is none other than Professor Bob White, who will be telling us all about the geology of Iceland in our talk today. For those who might be interested in visiting Iceland, here's where we'll be going. It's a week spent in the south of the country doing a loop from the southwest over to the southeast and back again. We'll head up to the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, which is like a little Iceland in miniature because the landscape is so diverse. If you've seen images of steaming lava fields, it's probably here. We'll be heading inland to the Barnafoss waterfall and to some very famous thermal springs. The water actually comes out of the ground at 100 degrees centigrade here, and it's used to power the central heating in some of the nearby towns. It's so hot. There is a chance to swim in them, but obviously they do mix it with glacier water to cool it down to a reasonable temperature. We'll obviously be visiting Thingvellir National Park, which is a rift valley that was created by the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates drifting apart. And we also visit the Thorsmork region too, which has the most incredible scenery. We're talking about desert and volcanoes and lava fields and glaciers, waterfalls, hot springs. And this is where you'll find the infamous and completely unpronounceable volcano which caused the ash cloud in 2010, if you remember that. Heading into the southeast, we had to include the Skaftafell Nature Reserve, which is where you find some very imposing black basalt columns at the Svartifoss waterfall. And this is a sort of geological relative of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, if you know that. And the most incredible lake is nearby as well, which has bits of broken off glacier that eventually flow down to the sea. There's loads more in the tour. And the best part is that, of course, Bob will be with us to explain everything, and also to talk about his amazing research as we go along. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of a taste. I'm just going to show you a few quick images of the places we'll be visiting on the tour because the pictures will do a far better job than I can. Here we have a shot from the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, which we'll be visiting on day 2. And there's those steaming lava fields. There's Thingvellir, which where you can see the rift. This is also where Europe's first ever parliament was held. So it does have historic importance as well as geological, and that's something that we do include some historic and cultural stuff in the tour as well. This is the pretty coastal town of Vic, where we'll be basing ourselves for a couple of nights. This bit of coast is known for those basalt sea stacks you can see in the background. And this is Geyser, where the English word for geyser comes from. It actually doesn't erupt all that often these days, but there is another geyser nearby that goes off every few minutes. Here's that incredible glacial lagoon that I mentioned. These huge chunks have broken off from Europe's biggest ice cap, and those black streaks you can see are the evidence of a historic volcanic eruption. So it's really, really cool. And lastly, here's Sparty Foss, where you can see those black basalt columns. We'll just be seeing loads of waterfalls on the tour. Honestly, I couldn't possibly put all of them in here. This is a country that has just got more waterfalls than you can ever dream of. I really hope you like the look of the tour. But just before I go, if you are feeling inspired after today's talk and you'd like the details of the tour, or in fact any of our alumni tours, you can find them all on our website, templeworld.com. If you forget that, don't worry. You can find all the tours on the University Alumni website too. On our website, you'll get to the alumni tours by clicking on the tab at the top of the page. We realise that we might not be able to run all of our tours this year, but we are still hoping that our later tours may still have the chance to run, fingers crossed. If we can't run some of our tours, we're planning on postponing them to next year. So I do think it's well worth registering your interest just to make sure you're the first to find out about them when the time comes. I'll now hand over to Professor White. Don't forget to ask your questions using the Q&A button, and I'll be here again at the end to put a few of those to Bob before we finish for the night.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I've been working in Iceland for, well, more than 25 years now, and it is a beautiful country. There's no doubt. That just made me nostalgic for it, seeing some of those pictures again. So what I plan to do today is actually tell you something about the research we do, the volcanic eruptions. I'm going to talk about two main ones. One in 2010, the Eyjafjallajökull eruption that stopped all the flights, and then one in 2014, which was the biggest historic eruption in Iceland since the 18th century. And the 18th century one was the biggest in the world, so it was a big eruption that we happened to capture. So I've really enjoyed working there, and I hope you'll enjoy some of the geology I can show you about. So somebody says there's no sound coming through. Is everybody else hearing sound? Put your thumbs up if it sounds okay. Yep, okay, so it sounds like other people are. Maybe it's something on his own computer. Okay, let me share a screen for the moment to show you some of the pictures that we've got. Okay, I'm just going to stop that because I forgot to press the one that makes sure that you can hear the sound on it. Okay, it's there. Good. Okay, this is that eruption that I'm going to talk about in a minute. A beautiful eruption because it happened in the middle of nowhere, didn't hurt anybody, and we found out a lot from it. But first of all, let me take you onto some of the basic geology of Iceland. It is actually part of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and you can see a ridge on this map. That's what separates Europe from North America. They're spreading apart at about 2 centimeters a year, which doesn't sound that much, but it means in your lifetime you'll end up 6 foot further away from New York than you started, which may be good or may not, depending on your point of view. But the rift goes right down the middle of the ocean, but it comes above land in Iceland. And I spent the first half of my career studying what happens underwater at rifts like this. And so it was really nice to be able to look at it on land instead. So I want to talk first of all about why the rift is above land in Iceland, because Iceland is entirely volcanic. There's nothing else there really except for volcanic rocks. And it should be 2 kilometers underwater like the rest of the rift, but it's not. And the reason is that there's what's called a mantle plume underneath, which is hot. Now, you probably know that the center of the Earth is molten, and the Earth has been cooling down since it was formed. And it's that molten core, or part of the core, which is molten, which creates our magnetic field. That's why we have magnetic field, which actually shields us from a lot of the harmful radiation from the sun, so it's a good thing. But that's losing heat. It is cooling down. It's going to be a long time before it's frozen. But that heat sometimes comes up in blobs of material, like you might remember lava lamps from the 70s, where blobs come up to the surface. These are solid. It's like the lava lamps are. It's solid material, but when it hits the skin of the Earth, which is about 100 kilometers thick and is brittle, it's decompressed somewhat. And the melting point of the material that's rising decreases somewhat as the pressure decreases. So as it rises up, some melt is formed just because you've slipped across the melting point because the pressure is lower. And that melt then bleeds out very quickly, and it bleeds into the crust of the Earth, which is basically the scum on top of the Earth. And then it ponds there, and then now and then some of it comes out as a volcano. So when you're pulling apart the two plates, you obviously can't make a hole in the middle, a void space. So actually it gets filled with volcanic rocks. But under Iceland, because it's got this hot plume underneath it, that does two things. It generates much thicker molten rock, and so the crust is much thicker there, and that causes it to bounce up a bit and be above sea level. And also, because this is hot, a bit hotter than the surrounding area, it's more buoyant, so it pushes the land up. So both those things conspire to bring Iceland above sea level, and it means we can look at this process of how it's rifting apart on land, which is much easier. And when you do that, when you look at Iceland on land, you can see that there's a series of these yellow rifts which go across land all the way from the south to the north. Now, each one of those is pulling apart. It's a rift, and each one has what's called a central volcano. It has a volcano, these little oval shapes in the middle of it. And each of those volcanoes feeds molten rock into that rift segment, which is typically about 100 kilometers long. So it's a whole series of segments which are spreading apart, and they spread out of kilter with each other, and that's going to be important. We'll see in a minute. Now, ironically enough, right above that mantle plume, which is the hottest part of the Earth's mantle underneath, of course, it's actually the coldest part on the surface. Because it's pushed the surface up, there's a big ice cap over it, which is called vatnajökull. And that's this big white area that I'm circling here. So the hottest part of the mantle underlies the coldest part and the highest part of Iceland. And the rift zone goes right through that. So we're going to look at what happens there. That's where that big eruption was in 2014, which was a huge one. And that's the way that the spreading is happening. It's about a total of about 20 millimeters a year, which is about the rate your fingernails grow as it happens. Now, in 1783, there was a huge eruption in this area, which was it's the biggest known historic eruption of this kind that's ever happened. And we know a lot about it because there was a priest there called Jon Stein Grimsson who recorded it in his journal. He actually recorded his journal for his children, but it's been translated and you can read about it now. And of course, Iceland is a very literate society. It's where the sagas came from. I think it's very literate because it's dark all winter, so there's nothing much else to do except tell tales to each other and write them down. But certainly Jon Stein Grimsson was very literate. And it's a very interesting story about the lifestyle there. And on the right-hand side, you can see the craters out of which that big eruption happened in 1783. Now, it was a big eruption. And unfortunately, the effects of the eruption caused 80% of the horses to die, half the cows, and 80% of the sheep to die. The reason they died was because there was fluorine poisoning in the gas, and that came out onto the grass, and then the sheep and horses died of that. Now, nobody was killed in the actual eruption because the lava flows quite slowly. And I'll show you some pictures of lava flowing, and you can run away from it. You can get away from it in front of it in general. So 50 farms were overrun, but nobody was killed. But what happened the next winter was that about 25% of the population of Iceland died, and they died from famine. It became known as the haze famine because of the haze from the volcanic gases. And this is a fascinating sociological tale, really, because Iceland was a vassal state of Denmark at the time. Denmark used to send, it completely controlled all of the commerce. It used to send a ship once per year, which would pick up dried fish and wool and that sort of thing from Iceland, and in return give them goods and food. It's not a particularly fertile country, it's all subsistence farming. And people in Europe knew that there was this nasty stuff going on in Iceland, but they didn't send any relief. So that's a very contemporary story, isn't it, nowadays, with people in some parts of the world starving while other people are overeating themselves to death, to be honest. It's not a shortage of food in the world, but it's a shortage of food in the right place. And this is what happened in Iceland in that year. So it became infamous. Now, I said that people knew what was happening, and indeed, one of the people that knew was Benjamin Franklin, who was the US ambassador to France at the time. He was based in Paris, and he was a bit of a scientist as well. And he noticed that it was terrible weather in Northern Europe, basically. There were horrible fogs. It was midsummer, but despite that, it was horrible weather. And he published a paper in the Memoirs of the Literary and Philosophical Society of Manchester. Now, being Cambridge, you can just go to the library and take it off the shelf and read it, which is amazing. But he got it right, because what he said was that in the summer months of 1783, when the effect of the sun's rays to heat the earth in the northern regions should have been greatest, there existed a constant fog over all Europe and a great part of North America. And he conjectured that it was from an eruption in Iceland correctly. Well, he wasn't sure whether it was an eruption or it was a meteorite that had impacted, but it was certainly an eruption. So he conjectured that right. And subsequently, people have worked out where the ash and dust and gases went. And that's a map there showing it went over the whole of Northwest Europe, which is remarkably similar to what happened with the eruption in 2010. In fact, several thousand people died particularly in northern Scotland, of breathing diseases, basically, because of the pollution in the air. And so they died from that. Now, if I plot on this as well, a more recent map from the 2010 eruption from that volcano Eyjafjallajökull, you can see it's almost identically the same, that the ash and everything came southeastwards and blanketed Northwest Europe. So it's happened before, and this is that 2010 eruption. The farmers in Iceland now know that there are poisonous gases coming from volcanoes, particularly fluorine was the worst one, and they put their livestock into barns. And this is what they're doing there with the ash from the volcano. This is right under the foot of the volcano at the time. Okay, so I thought I'd just spend a few minutes on that Eyjafjallajökull eruption in 2010, and then we'll look at the big one, which happened in the centre in 2014. So this was quite a benign eruption when it started, because the lava was coming out in a col between two mountains. And in fact, it became a big tourist attraction. So tens of thousands of people drove out from Reykjavik. It was just a few hours drive away. And actually nobody was killed by this eruption, but the police were really worried because there was a blizzard on the way back, and a lot of people got stuck on a mountain pass in their cars going back. So when this eruption started, it was just a great tourist attraction. It was this fire fountaining, like you can see there, but nothing bad. But something bad did happen afterwards. Now, let me just talk a little bit about what volcanoes are like. Often you get melt stored some distance underneath the summit. In this case, it was about 3 or 4 kilometers down. And there was molten rock under the volcano, which had been there since the mid-19th century. It just sat there cooling a little bit, but still molten. Now, it can do two things. Sometimes it goes sideways and then erupts some distance away. In the case of Eyjafjallajökull in 2010, it went sideways about 8 kilometers and came out on the flank of the volcano because there's less pressure there, so it's a bit easier for it to come out. Nowadays, we can track where the melt is going because as it cracks its way through the ground, it makes tiny little earthquakes, which we can detect. And then it comes out with these fire fountaining and a little bit of gas. But particularly when the mountain is covered by a glacier, what can happen is if the lava goes straight upwards, it hits the ice, and when the molten rock at about 1,200 degrees hits the ice, of course it melts it, forms water, and then more molten rock coming in, it freezes instantly and it boils and shatters. So essentially you get shrapnel coming out the top, which is what the ash is. It's tiny. When you look at it under a microscope, they're tiny little shards of broken glass, probably very carcinogenic. And they can get pushed up high into the air, 35,000 feet in this case. So that's what happened, and that's what people worry about happening. What happens to the ice as well at the bottom of the glacier at the top of the volcano is it gets melted, of course, and you get water, and some of that water sometimes floods out of the crater and makes a glacial outburst. It's called a jökulhlaup in Iceland, and that can be very damaging as well. Okay, so both these types of eruption happened in Eyjafjallajökull. Incidentally, Eyjafjallajökull is quite easy to understand because Eyja is an island. Fjallur is the same word as fell comes from. It's a Viking word, so a mountain, a fell. And Jökull is a glacier. So this is the glacier on top of the mountain by the island. The offshore island is Xerxe. So it's just a descriptive term. So the first eruption happened on a col between this mountain and the one to the east, which is called Katla, from this vent called Fimmvörðuháls, and that was quite benign. And there are all the earthquakes we located here. The blue ones are the well-located ones. So this is a sheet of molten rock sitting about 2 kilometers underneath the surface, and it flowed eastwards. But what then happened was that it went quiet. The eruption stopped for a couple of days, and then it moved westwards, and it hit that pocket of molten rock underneath the volcano summit, and that's what caused the violent eruption. So that was the flank eruption. Comes out of a fissure, you get fire fountaining, you get lava flows. You can see them in the bottom of the picture flowing downhill into the valley. But once it hit the summit, then you get massive amount of very nasty ash formed, which then is carried up into the upper atmosphere. Very typically, you can see the glacier underneath it here. Very typically, you get a lot of lightning because little fragments are pushing together. It makes static electricity, so you get a lot of lightning in these gas clouds and ash clouds, which is very dramatic. But of course, as far as we're concerned in England, what it did was cause a lot of flights to be cancelled. And a lot of people had, because it was over the Easter holidays, a lot of people had extra holidays in the Canaries or wherever they happened to be. Actually, we have some friends who lived near Heathrow at the time, and they said it was really good because it was good weather, it was high pressure, and that's why the ash didn't clear, it wasn't blown away. But the air was very clear, actually, because the ash was incredibly fine, and there weren't any planes flying and polluting the air. So actually the weather was better than normal. So they were having barbecues in their garden when they lived near Heathrow. The other thing we could see from our recordings was that we could track some very, very tiny earthquakes down to over 30 kilometers depth. And this is the track of the molten rock forcing its way upwards and cracking the rock as it goes up. This was the first time this had been seen, and it was really good because it means we can tell where the molten rock came from. Originally, it came up to the surface, it ponded in the surface, the fresh melt hit that old reservoir of rock, made it go unstable. And just like, you know, when you shake up a bottle of fizzy lemonade or champagne, if you're rich, you take the top off, let the pressure off, then it spurts out the top. And that's what happens with an eruption. The molten rock can sit there. It's got a lot of gas dissolved in it, mostly carbon dioxide and water actually as well. But as it decompresses, then they come out of solution and the gas has a much bigger volume. And so it drives it up, and the more it goes up the vent, the faster it goes. And so you get a violent eruption because of that. So it's just the same as fizzy lemonade, really. One of the amazing things about volcanoes is they're incredibly fertile. In fact, most of the soils on Earth that we grow our food in came originally through volcanoes. We wouldn't be here if it weren't. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for volcanoes. They bring up all the all the elements we need to make our bodies to the surface of the Earth, basically. I was there just a couple of months after the eruption. You could kick the ground and still see it glowing red hot underneath. But look at these amazing flowers that have grown through that ash. That's ash in the background, fresh ash, which was several a foot thick or so just here, incredibly fertile. So that was the 2010 eruption. I want to spend the rest of the time on this big eruption that happened over the center of that mantle plume in 2014. And just listen to this video. This describes a
volcanic eruptions exhibit tremendous power. In 2010, over 100,000 flights were grounded when the Icelandic volcano Eyjafjallajökull exploded. It shot ash 35,000 feet into the air. But sometimes molten rock simply flows out of the ground like a river. That's what happened in this eruption from Bardarbunga volcano 4 years later in Iceland. Not a single flight was cancelled. The Bardarbunga eruption may not have been as explosive, but it was actually 10 times bigger than Eyjafjallajökull. It released the energy of a Hiroshima atomic bomb, not just once, but every 2 minutes, hour after hour, day after day, month after month, for half a year. At the University of Cambridge, we tracked the underground movement of the molten rock before it erupted, using the 30,000 tiny earthquakes that were produced as it forced its way through the Earth's crust. Students working out in Iceland found themselves in an exciting race using helicopters, snow scooters and four-wheel drives in one of the most rugged areas on Earth, trying to predict where an eruption might occur. The last few seismometers were deployed just hours before the molten rock erupted right in the midst of them, having travelled underground for 46 kilometres from the volcano. Then the race was on again to retrieve the closest seismometer and its valuable data, minutes before it was buried by the advancing lava flow. In volcanic systems, molten rock frequently intrudes its way through the Earth's crust. It is difficult to predict when or where it will erupt at the surface and what the impact might be. Our work at the University of Cambridge, studying earthquakes in volcanic systems, helps in understanding the processes leading up to these dramatic events.
Well, you can see why I enjoy watching them. So what happened in this eruption was that the molten rock was under a very big volcano with a thick 800-meter thick ice cap over it. That's that Vatnajökull ice cap. But the molten rock went sideways laterally for 50 kilometers before it erupted. And then it came out of vents 50 kilometers away. And it's those earthquakes we were tracking. So I just want to show you a little bit about what fieldwork is like for us in Iceland. It is a very remote area. It's on the Arctic Circle almost. It's about 5,000 foot high, so it's very cold. And you can only get there for 2 months in the summer, basically. I just looked at the temperature there today and it's minus 14. If you think it's cold in Cambridge or Oxford, it's a lot colder there. So we stay in mountain huts. There's a lot of mountain huts like this one, which are in beautiful locations, and they're very basic, but usually there's nobody else there. The terrain is pretty barren. There are a few tracks across it, and you're supposed to keep to those because it is desert. And if you go across virgin desert and there are some plants there, it'll take decades for them to grow again. Here's a picture of what a good day looks like in Iceland. So we're going across a plain of ash here. We're on the road. You can tell that from the posts. The posts show where the road is. And in the background, there's a beautiful mountain called Hedebraith, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. That's 3,000 foot high. That's a volcanic mountain. So a lot of the driving is over ash like this. Some of it's over lava flows, some of it's through rivers. That's a good day. Of course, most of the days are like this. And it's rather foggy and wet. And in this case, there's dust storms. We're about to come down into that area where the previous video was. And you can see the dust on the horizon. And it gets everywhere. It gets in your eyes and your ears and in your nose. So I think dust is worse than rain, actually, to be honest, or even snow. It's just horrible. You can't get away from it. So that's more typical. Just, of course, you only take photos when it's nice. That's the trouble. And it's often said that the weather in Iceland, you can go through all 4 seasons in one day, because it changes so fast because the wind is blowing quite strongly usually. But one thing I do notice when I land back in England is how smelly England is. The air is so clean here that you really notice it when you get back. Of course, you get used to it after a bit, but it is lovely clean air. The other thing you have to do is cross rivers. And the next video is showing you a river crossing on a glacial outwash with that car with a big trailer full of batteries in the back, so quite heavy. Now, normally when you go through rivers, you go quite slowly. In this case, you have to go reasonably fast. And by fast, I mean only about 10 or 15 kilometers an hour, because it's very soft sand and you don't want to sink into it. So here's a river crossing. Listen out, right at the end, there's a comment the passenger in the back makes, which is quite funny when we get to the other side. So this is glacial outwash. You want to go across it early in the day before the snow melt gets bigger. And we are on the road, believe it or not, such as the road is. So we're halfway across. So the other side is coming in view. You'll see the yellow post, which is showing where the road is. Of course, it gets changed every day by the water. So just listen to what the passenger says when we draw to a stop.
Now a good time to tell you I got absolutely soaked.
Did you hear that? Is it a good time to tell you I got absolutely soaked? She said in the back. Okay, so here's our typical fieldwork. This is what a seismometer looks like. It has the seismometer itself. It is a motion detector in three axes. It's buried under the ground. We have some leads up to the surface. We have batteries which are buried, solar panels to power it through the air, a GPS to give a time base. This is a lava plane. We had to carry batteries, they're truck batteries, about 120 ampere, 5 kilometers across this, which is quite hard work. But this is that beautiful mountain called Herdebreið, which looks like an Icelandic bonnet. And it's a really interesting one because it tells you how thick the ice was at the time it was formed. It was formed at the end of the Ice Age. And when the molten rock hits the ice, it makes this rather soft stuff called hyaloclastite. But on top of it, there's a lava flow, which makes a hard lid. And you can actually see the volcanic cone it came from at the top, that pimple at the top. So what happens when the ice has melted is that you get this rigid cap and then this rather soft stuff. So it's very steep on each side. So we know exactly how thick the ice was at the time it melted, 3,000 foot. And in fact, at the end of the Ice Age, there was about 10,000 years ago, there was a huge outburst of volcanism because as the ice melts, it releases the pressure on the ground underneath, and it allowed a lot of melt to come out. So the rate of melt production was about 10 times normal. And in fact, the same thing is happening now. If you measure the height of the Vatnajökull ice cap, it's melting and it's uplifting as you take the load off. And it's uplifting at about 20 millimeters a year, about the same rate as the spreading. And there is an outburst of volcanism, which is beginning now as well. So that's one of the sad results of global climate change. Okay, where's the volcano that melt came from? It's called Bardarbunga, and it's underneath the ice cap, so you can't see it, except if I draw it on, you can sort of see the circular shape of it. It's 80 square kilometers, and that subsided during the eruption by about 65 meters, as 1.8 cubic kilometers of rock, molten rock, came out from it. So in cross section, you could measure the depression of the surface through the eruption, which lasted 6 months. And 65 meters is quite a lot of depression as the melt was drawn out from that storage area way down beneath the surface, 6 kilometers down. Well, it traveled 50 kilometers before it erupted, and I just thought I'd show you what that looks like. If you're in Cambridge, it means that the lava, the molten rock, flowed underground from somewhere near Hitchin before it erupted under Great St Mary's Church, which is what I've put in as the centre of Cambridge. And then it covered an area with lava out to Wickham Fen, if you ever went out there, if you ever had a Sunday off to go for a cycle ride. Since there are people from Oxford as well, I thought I'd better put in Oxford. It's as if the volcano was in Swindon and the molten rock came underground all the way from Swindon and then erupted in the centre of Oxford. So it's a long way, and it's pretty scary that it can go that far. But in fact, that's exactly what happened in Hawaii a couple of years ago, when molten rock from the main caldera, the main crater there, flowed a similar distance underground and came up in the Leilani Estates. And it literally, there were fissures in people's gardens, and then molten rock started coming out of them. It destroyed in the end about 700 houses there, and they had to evacuate 2,000 people. So it does happen, and we still have to understand why. Now here's an animation of what happened. So it took 2 weeks for the molten rock to travel that 50 kilometers. It travels in bursts at a few kilometers per hour, and then it stalls when it gets stuck. So we were watching this happening at the time because we knew from the transmission of the seismic data where the earthquakes were. So we rushed out and put extra receivers where we thought it would erupt, and indeed it did erupt just there because it was a low point in the topography. So we got a really good record of what happened when it erupted. So I'm going to show you in detail that northern part of that. It's called a dike when it travels underground. And it erupted in the north here. So I'm going to show you in detail because that's where we had the best seismic receivers, so we've got the best resolution. And here there are something like 30,000 little earthquakes. They're tiny earthquakes, you wouldn't feel them. And you can see them moving northwards and in cross section. And actually this is the first time in the world this has been seen. Usually you just see the end result of the lava when it gets erupted at the surface, but we can actually see it in the act of travelling underground. As I said, 6 kilometers down, so a long way under before it erupted. Now, the interesting thing is that it got underneath the final eruption site quite a long time, several days. You can see the days going by in the left-hand side before it forced its way to the surface. So it's as if it was trying to get enough pressure head built up to move, to break through to the surface. That's one interesting thing. Second interesting thing is that it actually erupted through exactly the same craters as a 19th century eruption, which had obviously followed exactly the same path. So it's not surprising that it used the same ones because they're probably weaker. So this was amazing to be able to record its progress. And there's various things you can see, like it got stuck somewhere in the south here, and it tried several times to get through. It sent forward fingers, and then it eventually broke through with a slight offset. So this is a treasure trove, really, in understanding how molten rock moves underground. In cross section, you can see that all those earthquakes are happening at about 6 kilometers depth, which is the boundary between the brittle and the ductile region. So as you go deeper, the rock gets more ductile, a bit like toffee, so you can stretch it, but the upper part is cold, so it breaks brittly. Now this, I said, was spreading at 20 millimeters a year, and you spread in the ductile part, you can gently pull it, but the cold bit at the top gets stuck. It doesn't break, except for every 150 years. So by the time you've accumulated 150 years worth of separation, that's about 3 meters. And that's what happened here. It broke about 3 meters, and we can measure the motion with GPS. And the earthquakes build up. The biggest stress boundary is between the ductile bit where the stress has been relieved and the rigid bit where it's not moved except when it breaks in these rift events. And so that's why the earthquakes are there. The other thing that was very clear was that you're building up pressure from 50 kilometers away from the volcano. When it eventually broke through to the surface, that pressure dropped because it had a free running conduit all the way to the surface. And you can work out the size of it. It was about 10 meters diameter from the viscosity and the rate of flow. And then the pressure dropped and the earthquakes decreased markedly, although there still were some. When you're at the vent, one of the fascinating things is that it's incredibly noisy. I hadn't quite realised it would be like that, but it's not surprising really, because they're jet engines, basically, forcing material out at high speed. These fire fountains are about 100 metres high, 300 foot high. The brown stuff is sulphur dioxide, and it's more sulphur dioxide than the whole of the European Union produces in a year. 35,000 tonnes per day is being produced here. And that's very nasty stuff. You don't want to breathe that. The other amazing thing, I'm going to go quiet in a minute so you can hear it, is when you're away from the vent, near the front of the lava flow, all you hear is the sound of breaking glass. Now listen carefully when I start speaking, you might be able to hear that, and I'll explain why. Well, I don't know whether you could hear that, but it is amazing to hear the sound of breaking glass, because this molten rock's at about 1,000 degrees. But when it chills at the surface, it makes glass. That's what glass is. It's usually it's made from silica if you want to see through it. So it's glass, and then the lava flows over it and breaks these plates of glass. So it's very nasty stuff to walk over, because, and I've done it, if you fall over, even an old one, you'll cut your hands on glass very easily. The lava was flowing very quickly, and we did have to pull, the technician suddenly zoomed off in his car and pulled this whole instrument off and stuck it in the car. The manufacturer's instructions are to be really, really careful. These are really sensitive instruments, treat them really, really carefully. He just pulled it out of the ground and chucked it in the back of the car, and it still worked afterwards, and it would have got covered by this lava, which was advancing about 1 meter every couple of minutes. Okay, so the last thing I want to show that you can do with these earthquakes is a really interesting thing, and I'll just take a minute to explain it, which is that you can work out how strong the rocks are when they break. Now, the green line here is the shape of the dike, and that's where the rift opened about 3 meters. And as it does that, it puts the surrounding area into compression, which is the blue. And so that suppresses any earthquakes, because anything that wants to shear is squashed, the two plates are squashed together harder, the two pieces that want to shear, so it doesn't. But at the tip of the crack, you get very high stresses, which promote shearing. Now, this segment has broken, and now there's high stresses in the bit of it. It's relieved the stress in the segment where the dike was, but we've built up stresses ahead of it. So what I'm going to show you next is what was happening 30 kilometers ahead of the tip of the dike. The blue stations are all our stations we put out, so we had a really good record. Now, look at the seismicity in this area in the green rectangle, which has been stressed by that dike, but it's a long way away from the dike. And there's normal background seismicity. It is on a rift zone. See, I'm looking here at a year before and a year after. Now, there was a burst there as it got going. Then there's a massive burst. Did you see that massive burst of seismicity? It just lit up everywhere. It will run through again, and we'll just see that when we get to 2014, late August, a real burst of seismicity, which was induced by the stress change from the dike, which was 30 kilometers away. There it is. Now I'm just going to show a few days around the actual occurrence of that stress peak, which I'm showing here. Now, there were thousands of earthquakes. Now, the significant thing here is that we can work out exactly what the stress was that caused this earthquake to break. And normally you need huge amount of stresses to break rocks. If you ever tried to smash up a lump of concrete with a lump hammer, which I pulled up an old fence or something, it's really hard. Rocks are really strong. They need, in the units you use, they're megapascals. Now, these were breaking at 100 kilopascals, which is about a third of a bar. It's equivalent to the pressure exerted by a few feet of water, a few meters, well, 3 meters of water, something like that. These are very, very low stress drops. If you just push your hands together, that's about the stress that's causing this break. And the lesson here is, well, first of all, this is the first time in the world, really, anybody's been able to look at the static stress change and what it does. But the important thing is that if there are faults that are primed, ready to go, you just give them a little kick and they'll go. And that's what happened here. And that is relevant to all the discussion about fracking. because if there are faults in the vicinity, it doesn't need to be high stress to trigger them. If they're primed, ready to go, then they will go, like these did just here. And in fact, that has happened once in Geneva. They were drilling for hot water, and they triggered a pre-existing fault that nobody knew about. And I don't think it killed anybody, but various chimneys fell down and damage was done. So it is a live issue as people try to drill, if not for oil, which might not be a good idea. They might be drilling for geothermal energy. Okay, let me just finish just a couple of minutes with some of my holiday snaps. You can imagine when you spent a week in the field with dust everywhere and no washing, that it's really nice to have a wash. This is a year after the eruption, and this is the front of the lava flow, and there was a glacial river. If you look really hard, you'll see the glacier in the background. The glacial outwash was running underneath the lava and getting heated up really nicely. So the front half dozen people are from our team. The others are locals who drove here. They drove 100 kilometers here to go swimming. And that was it's really nice because you could adjust your temperature to be slightly hotter or slightly colder by moving across the stream. Sadly, we went back a year or two later and it had cooled down, so it wasn't such a nice idea. We've already seen pictures of the beautiful hexagonal lava columns you get. This is when a sheet of molten rock underground cools slowly and contracts. It makes these hexagonal columns. But everywhere around the coast, in fact, everywhere I think that tour is going, there are beautiful flowers which are growing in the middle of the barrenness, which is incredible, really. But there are local residents, and you see them around the coast everywhere. These are some photos I took. You can get really close to the puffins, which are as cute as you think they are from the stuffed toys. The other thing is that it's very fertile seas around there, and so that's why there's so many birds, millions of birds around Iceland, just living off the bounty in the sea. And perhaps one of my favorite birds is the tern, the Arctic tern, bringing home supper here. But they're wicked things for attacking you, particularly during the nesting season. They're like the fighter planes of the sky, really. They're incredibly agile, and they dive for the highest points. They'll dive for your head and they'll draw blood if you're not careful. And they always say you should walk around with an umbrella or a walking stick above your head. That's what the locals do. So they go for the top of the stick and not for your head. But they are beautiful birds, and they're all over the place. And then, of course, there are some rarer birds like this red-throated diver. There's plenty of those sort of things too. Iceland, I said, was a very literate society. It's a very artistic society too. They have a lot of time for that in the winter. And I want to show this because this person here, Brander, is the son of our main collaborator in Iceland, who's paralyzed from the neck down, sadly. He saw the eruption, decided to take up painting, and he painted this beautiful picture of the eruption with the steam as it flowed over the lava, over a riverbed. And we actually used it as the front cover of a publication that we had. And he'd only just learnt to paint. So thank you very much for your attention. We've got a few minutes, I think, if people want to ask questions, and I'll be, if I can answer them, I'll be very happy to tell you my perspective on them. So I'll stop sharing now and go back to Alice or somebody.
Thank you so
Alice,
much, Bob. That was really, really fascinating. It has definitely made me want to be the tour manager on our tours, just so that I get to come along. I think that yeah, it's essential that I make it myself now. I'm very excited about Iceland. I think it looks absolutely amazing, and the chance of having you along explaining everything as we go, I think, is absolutely invaluable. We have had some interesting questions from the participants in the talk while you've been talking. We'll see how many we've got time for, but I'll just start off with one of the. Dean has asked, is there any tsunami activity resulting from the Iceland eruptions and any associated earthquakes?
Yes, generally not, because to make a tsunami you have to collapse into the sea, and most of the volcanoes are in the interior. That's where the most active area is, and so you don't get much collapse. But I mean, the possibility is there that you could, and there have certainly been some huge tsunamis in the North Atlantic in times past, actually mostly coming from Norwegian slumps, from just slumps of land, which have gone way inshore in Scotland, for instance. So the possibility is there, but I've never heard of any, I don't think, apart from ones which were formed elsewhere.
Well, that's probably quite good to know. Somebody else has asked, Anne has asked, what is the relationship between Cambridge and the University of Iceland? Is there a relationship that you have with local researchers?
Yes, I'm an honorary professor there, which is rather nice, or adjunct professor or something. They've made me an honorary person there, which is really good because it means we can work with their people, use their facilities for storage. And the driver of that vehicle, which is the chief, he's one of their technicians, who happens to be one of the chief drivers for the mountain rescue. So he's really used to driving over rivers and rocks and up on glaciers even, with huge tires. And crossing rivers is really dangerous, actually. The main cause of death in Iceland of tourists is getting stuck in rivers.
Oh my goodness.
So we're really pleased to have him. He's an amazingly good, not where you're going, it's all paved, the roads where you're going, but he is an amazing driver, and they're such nice people.
Oh, brilliant. Another interesting question from, I think Ilona has asked, obviously some of those images showed your researchers getting extremely close to the lava flows. How do they not breathe in poisonous gases? You just mentioned there was quite a lot of poisonous gases that, you know, have caused huge problems in the past. So how does that not affect you?
Numbers of things. You make sure the wind is blowing away from you. You park your vehicle facing away from it with the engine running, because engines have stopped sometimes. And actually they stopped people going there shortly afterwards because it was not very good. We were the first people there, so it was okay. But yeah, you do have to be really careful. I think she's quite right.
Yeah, that's good. I wanted to know how far in advance, actually it ties in with somebody else's question who's asking about predicting which volcano will next potentially threaten Europe. Tim has asked that, and along that question, I just wanted to know, I can see that you're tracking the seismic activity prior to a volcano erupting. How much warning can you give of something quite like a big eruption that could cause, you know, damage to homes or that sort of thing?
Yeah, these sort of eruptions are safer than those that are around the Pacific Rim, which really give no warning. But usually it's not earthquakes that warn you. Usually you can see the edifice swelling up. Nowadays with satellites, you can measure changes in the elevation of the volcano of a few centimeters. So usually before an eruption, you have lava coming in underground, makes it swell up. You can see that, and so you can think, oh, that's interesting, I wonder what's happening there, and look at it a bit more closely. And you can measure it with GPS as well. But the period of the eruption, if it's going vertically, is usually the seismicity usually breaks through in a matter of hours, a few hours. It's quite quick because it travels at several kilometers per hour.
Wow.
And of course it accelerates as it gets, because it's driven by this gas coming out of solution. It accelerates as it goes up.
Yeah.
In that particular case, it went sideways, so we had 2 weeks warning, but actually nobody lived there anyway, so it didn't really matter. So usually you get a few hours, but prior to that, you often get sort of rumblings and you can see the edifice swelling up. So generally, they're fairly safe. But what's not safe is that if it suddenly breaks through and makes an ash cloud, then in some places, aeroplanes have gone through those by mistake. And there was a famous one in South Africa. They're at 30,000 feet. They lost all their engines. And the standard response is to dive to try and clear the air. And they dived down, it's really low, I forget what it was, a few thousand feet before they got one started. And then they leveled out. So that's the most dangerous thing. And they're very careful with warnings to the aviation industry about any Icelandic eruptions.
Yeah, oh gosh, that's pretty terrifying. Somebody's asked, Heather has asked, is there any evidence that volcanism in Iceland is increasing?
I think it probably is, just anecdotally. There's somewhere erupts every few years in Iceland, but it's hard to know on such a short timescale that we're on now. But I think almost certainly it is, because the deglaciation that's happening due to global climate change now, anthropogenically caused, is about the same rate as it was at the end of the last ice age. And we know there was a 10-fold increase over a period of a few hundred years, probably, at that stage. So it probably is increasing, but it's always pretty active anyway in Iceland. So
yeah, it looks like it. Goodness. Let me see. We have Christine has asked, will Iceland eventually split in two because of the separation?
Yes, a very good question. Yeah, almost certainly it will. I don't know if you noticed that actually Vatnajökull is on the eastern side of Iceland, and when you follow the Mid-Atlantic Ridge up from the south, it's called the Reykjanes Ridge, it then jogs eastwards, goes through Iceland, and then jogs west north of Iceland again. So, and that's because the mantle plume underneath with respect to Iceland is drifting eastwards. And so it's easier for the crust to break above that hot air because it's weaker there. So at the moment, it's take a big jog to the east and then a jog to the west, north of Iceland. It'll find energetically it's not worth doing that in a bit, and it'll just break off and stay on the east. And actually, there are analogues for that. So Tristan da Cunha, which is a British island in the South Atlantic, is on the east side of the rift, and there is a big underwater ridge which goes all the way from South America to Africa, which was exactly the same as Iceland, and then it drifted off to the east some tens of millions of years ago, and now it's a volcanic island stuck on the east. So eventually that's what will happen. Yeah, not in our lifetimes, but it will happen. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, definitely. What are we talking? We're talking millions of years, or
yeah.
Yeah. Steve.
Well, Iceland is very young geologically. It's only 20 million years old, which is young as these things go. Yeah.
But it is visible. You said that there was a certain number of centimeters every year that they do keep moving apart.
Oh yeah, it's 2 centimeters every year, 20 millimeters a year. You can measure that with GPS even these days.
Yeah, that's amazing. Steve has asked, he was just wondering, right at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned in the 1782 eruption, horses, cows, and sheep died of fluorine poisoning. He just wondered why not humans. He just wondered if the fluorine travels faster than the lava, or was an underpopulated area.
Yeah, the fluorine was in the gases, yeah, so it went everywhere. I think humans probably were affected by it. People have dug up some of the graves from that era and found that their bones are affected by fluorine poisoning, yeah. And there are some people in Cambridge, there's a doctor that actually specialises in looking at volcanic deaths, actually. And so he's done a lot of work on this, yeah. So there's quite a lot known about it, and about deaths in Northwest Europe as well, from the gases that came down to Europe.
Yeah, so eventually, like, it will definitely affect humans.
Oh, well, they're very careful now. So the Icelanders put out warnings every day, depending, they do a projection like our weather. They say, you know, the sulfur dioxide level is such and such, it's going to the northeast, and people in that town should stay indoors, wear masks and things. So, and they're not eating stuff that's fluorine poison. So yeah, they're very careful about it. I mean, Europe has regulations about sulfur dioxide levels too, and in fact, in this last eruption, they were exceeded in Western Ireland by gases carried down, just for a few days, not for long.
So it's something that they definitely, you can see why they need to keep an eye on it. But we're at just before 8 o'clock here. There are some more questions, so I don't know how are you fixed for time in terms of answering a couple more questions?
I'm fine. I can stay as long as you like, but I think people should be free to go if they want to.
Yeah. Claire from Cambridge, what do you think?
Yes, I think if there's a couple more questions, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, thank you for everybody else that's joined us so far. Thank you so much. If you are going to sign off now, really, really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you. Anybody who wants to stay on, we do have a couple more questions. We have been asked by Ken, will the magma eventually cool to such a degree that continental drift eventually slows down or stops?
The drift isn't being driven by the magma. Sorry, the center of the Earth eventually will freeze, and then probably it will stop, yeah. And that's happened on some other planets. But that's not going to happen for a long time. You might know the center of the Earth, the very core of it is solid, it's nickel iron, and then there's a molten bit around it, and then the outer bit up to the surface is solid again. So it's that bit that's cooling. That's going to take a very long time yet, so we shouldn't worry about it.
We don't have to worry about it. That's good.
I don't think so.
Pat has asked, do you expect more islands like Xerxe to appear?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. The interesting thing is that eastern rift, of which we were looking at, both those volcanoes, it seems to be propagating southwards. And that Eyjafjallajökull is just on the southern Well, Xerxe is on the southern tip of it, and Eyjafjallajökull is a bit inshore, and Hekla, actually, the other one you will have heard of, is very close by, just to the northwest. So, yes, very likely, I think, that there will be more volcanic islands like Xerxe down to the south.
Yeah, and then do they come? Are they hotspots? Is that what happens?
I think it's the rift. As you rift apart, as you pull the Earth apart, then you can't leave a big void space. So molten rock fills up the gap. So yeah, they're centers of molten rock. Yeah.
Thank you. Janet has asked, do you use drone technology? Do you ever go up above with drones? Presumably that's much safer than trying to helicopter or anything like that.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, people do use that's been an amazing development, actually, drones and radio controlled airplanes. And I know people are using them in South America to look at volcanoes which are really remote and really high, and you can pre-program the planes, and they're using them also to take gas samples and so on across the vents, places you could never possibly go otherwise. I did see one drone that got half melted by the time it got back, so well, it's better than melting yourself, I guess.
Yeah, they're not cheap, those, the really good quality drones. I'm sure that person who was running that was most upset when he got that back.
Yeah.
Derek asks, is the whole succession of northeast to southwest plate margin strips all still active, or only the furthest west margin active? Or does the succession simply record where the margin was at the last, as the last hotspot moved?
If I'm understanding this right, then the hotspots don't last forever. They usually have a lifetime. They're instabilities, and they, like the lava lamps, they're blobs that come up, maybe last 50 million years or something. Quite short geologically. But the rift right down the middle of the Atlantic will carry on because the two plates are moving apart, and so that'll be there until something else happens and maybe it gets squashed up again. These ocean basins are formed and then destroyed as well, and the place they're destroyed all around the Pacific, that's where the Pacific Rim of Fire is where the oceanic plate is being pushed down underneath the land, and that's where you get really violent and unpredictable volcanoes. That's why they're much more dangerous, because you're pushing stuff together. Where you're pulling it apart like this, they're much safer, basically. The ice is a peculiarity to Iceland. It's unusual for a volcano to erupt through ice, and that does cause that ash. But if you don't have ice, you just get a rift, a fissure, and you get fire fountaining and nice rivers of lava flowing out from it. But it doesn't open along the whole rift simultaneously of thousands of kilometers. It does it in little segments, which are a bit like unzipping a zip, I guess. So, and each time you've unzipped one bit, you stress the next bit. So that's why we think the northern area, the segment to the north, will probably be the next one to go. But whether it's this year or a decade or 100 years, I don't know. That level is not very predictable.
Fantastic. And let me just see if we've got any other questions. There are quite a few questions. I'm just trying to work out which. One person's asked, Jeffrey has asked, should we worry about car engine emissions when so much pollution is caused by natural volcanic activity? I don't know if that's a question for a geologist.
No, that's a really good question. I've written a book on sustainability, actually.
Oh, really? Well,
so I'm very interested in climate change. A big volcano does put an awful lot of stuff up into the atmosphere, like Pinatubo did, but generally it's a very localized source, of course, because it's a pinpoint source, if you like, from the volcano, and it may get carried right around the world, and it does by the jet stream and so on, and then it gets rained out. It's usually short-lived, and so it gets rained out in months or years at least. And unlike cars, which are everywhere in the world and they're just emitting 365 days a year, blanketing everywhere, so they are much worse in that respect. So volcanoes cause a short local problem, but then it's rained out, it's removed.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can use volcanoes as an excuse not to have your SUV, I'm afraid.
And I think this is going to be one of the last questions. How exactly do you measure the flow of lava underground in such detail? I know you had those instruments, and what do they actually do, and how do they work?
Okay, no, I'm very happy to explain that. They're seismometers, so they detect the ground motion. An earthquake is actually, it's shearing, so it's two pieces of rock moving against each other. It's not an explosion, actually, it's a shear. And that sends out waves in every direction. And we know how fast the waves travel. And so it's a bit like an echo. You know, sometimes if there's a cliff and you yell to the cliff and then you get your echo coming, you say hello, and then hello comes back. You know the speed of sound in air, it's about 300 meters a second. So if you time the distance between them, you can work out how far away the cliff is. Or you might do it with lightning as well, you know, because the lightning travels at the speed of light, 186,000 miles a second. And the sound travels at 300 meters a second. So if you count the time between them, you can tell how far away the lightning is, which is, I sort of do it automatically. Whenever lightning happens, my head goes 1, 2, 3. Sort of can't help it. And so it's the same sort of idea, actually. Now, if you just have one receiver, all you can tell, you can work out how far away it is, but it could be anywhere in a circle. If you have 3 receivers, you can triangulate, because each one has a very accurate time base. We know that the time of the arrival that's caused by that shearing to within a millisecond, a thousandth of a second. So if you've got 3, you can triangulate and work out where it came from. If you've got 72, you can triangulate really well, and work out where it's come from. So we had 72 receivers, and we were detecting earthquakes which were magnitude 0, actually, and the magnitude scale is a very funny one for you know, they say it's been a magnitude 6 earthquake. It's a logarithmic scale. So the earthquakes we're detecting are about 50,000 times smaller than that one that in Japan, for example, that caused the Fukushima power plant to be flooded. So we can detect tiny earthquakes that you would never feel, and down at 20 kilometers even, by triangulating in on them, basically. So there are various other tricks we do to make it more accurate, but we can tell a relative location within a few tens of meters even, which is pretty amazing as far as I can tell, really.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I think we're just about some of the questions are there, but I think they're similar to other questions. So I think we've pretty much answered them, and I really appreciate you taking the time to go through all of those. It was absolutely fascinating talk, and I really am keeping both my fingers and toes crossed that we'll be able to run our tour in July, because I do think that seeing all of this in the flesh, if you like, actually being able to look at it and have it explained as you're looking at it, there's just no substitute for that. And I think that, yeah, I think if we get to go, it'll be amazing. And hopefully if we don't get to go this year, then I would really love it. We'll obviously be talking to you to see if we can twist your arm and get you to do it next year instead, because it's so educational and so fascinating. And we can see from the kind of comments that we're getting on the chat that I think this has a real universal appeal. And I thank you for making it so accessible to everybody, even to me. I didn't do a geology degree. And I found it very easy to follow up to a point. The pronunciations are still beyond me. You did a fantastic job with those. So thank you. And thanks to everyone who's joined.
I go every year, and actually it doesn't feel like summer unless I've seen the midnight sun. Of course, in July you will see midnight sun. And somehow I seem to have missed, and I didn't manage to go this year because of the restrictions. So summer slipped by somehow. So I didn't see the midnight sun.
Fantastic. Well, I hope that you get to go even for your research this year. That, you know, I know that I'm sure it must be it must have been a bit strange. I think you did get to go a little bit last year, didn't you? But fingers crossed that all of that stuff.
Some of my team did, but I didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I really hope that that things can resume again. I'm sure everybody agrees with me. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who's attended. It's been a wonderful talk. I appreciate it.